The sea boiled, the earth turned to liquid, and the death toll in Indonesia continues to rise. It is just one of many times that nation has faced death and destruction after a tsunami has struck following an earthquake. So why is it so hard to predict such natural disasters? Is complacency and poor planning having the greatest impact on loss of life? Hello, welcome to Roundtable with me, David Foster. Is the big one coming? The earthquake to end all earthquakes and a large part of civilization. That's what some doom merchants believe, and any time now they say, but, and it's a big but, you never know when or if. And that's why prediction and protection are so vital.
We live on a seismically active planet, where populations continue to grow in disaster-prone areas. But with no control over where or when the next big earthquake will strike, how prepared can we be for the aftermath of a disaster? The Ring of Fire is home to 90% of the world's earthquakes. Outlining the edge of the Pacific Ocean, it's the meeting point for several tectonic plates, where some of history's most devastating natural disasters have happened, and will continue to happen. A surge of seismic activity around the Ring of Fire this year has some wondering if it's all part of a bigger pattern. But scientists can't yet predict when or where earthquakes will strike, or how large they will be.
There seems to be periods of time when we get a lot of more really large, great earthquakes than other times. And people have studied this in the past and tried to discern some pattern that's other than just random, than what you would expect in a random pattern. And so far they haven't been able to identify anything that's meaningful.
Indonesia has had its fair share of earthquakes and tsunamis. Its disaster management agency estimates that 148 million people live in earthquake-prone areas. But when it was rocked by the magnitude 7.5 earthquake last month in Sulawesi, the tsunami detection system failed to warn the people in time. The agency admits part of the system has been out of action since 2012 because of budget cuts, vandalism, and poor maintenance. Power cuts because of the earthquake also stopped sirens and text messages from relaying the danger. Japan has rigorous anti-earthquake building codes. It also has a tsunami warning and earthquake alert system. The alarm was triggered for the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that killed 15,000 people and caused $300 billion in damages. But without it, those numbers could have been a lot higher. Precious seconds of warning can stop high-speed trains, shut down dangerous industrial systems, and give people time to take cover. Japan and Mexico are the only two countries with this type of technology. The west coast of the United States is piloting its system this year. Japan's government has also heavily invested in public education. And because no warning system is foolproof, it's still the most basic but effective safety measure for populations at risk. The big one could strike any time next week or in the next 200 years. And it may be years before scientists predict earthquakes with any accuracy. What can be controlled is how to mitigate and prepare for the aftermath.
Joining us via Skype, I'm pleased to say, from Western Australia, Chris Elders, Professor of Geology at Curtin University. Then we move to Edinburgh, and Professor John McCloskey, Professor of Natural Hazard Science at Edinburgh University, with me at the round table. Professor Andreas Kappos, Director of the Research Centre for Civil Engineering Structures at City University, and Robin Andrews, freelance science journalist. Very good to have you on the programme. Chris, can I come to you first of all? Is there a big one coming?
Well, as your report has just indicated, that's almost impossible to predict. There will be big earthquakes. They do occur on a more or less regular basis, and there will be one in the future. But exactly where it'll be and which fault is going to be the one that causes the next really big earthquake is very, very difficult to
So
tell.
should I read anything into the fact, I've got this piece of paper in my hand with the top 20 magnitude earthquakes of all time, that 6 of the biggest ones have been in the last 50 years?
Well, that is true, but the regularity with which earthquakes occurs is something that's really quite difficult to form a pattern of on the very short time scale of human experience. Over geological time scales, it would probably look like a fairly regular pattern, but just what we happen to be observing in the relatively short period of human awareness makes it seem very episodic.
Okay, so John, what do you make of the fact? Is it just coincidental? Is it just the fact that we started taking notes a bit more regularly now? Or is some kind of pattern there?
Well, there's certainly no evidence that there's any long-term change in the rates. So the processes that happen are naturally episodic. And this does not mean that they happen regularly. It means that they happen, the null hypothesis, if you like, is just that they happen randomly. And random events don't happen uniformly in time, so they naturally cluster. And that clustering would tend to give you periods where you get more activity than others. And it doesn't mean there's anything behind that. However, we do understand some of the physical processes that can lead to clustering. And I think in many cases, we do see things that are more clustered than random and that we understand why they are. So for example, the 2004 Sumatra earthquake, which generated the Indian Ocean tsunami, was followed very quickly within 3 months by the 2005 Nias earthquake, magnitude 8.7. It's definitely on your list of 20 greatest earthquakes. And it was almost certainly triggered by the earthquake that happened just before it. So you had a 9.1 and an 8.7 happening within 3 months. And this isn't random. We understand the physics behind that, but it also illustrates the really fundamental reason why these things are not predictable. The interaction probably generated an 8.7 magnitude earthquake, the 4th biggest ever recorded at that time. And the triggering force was about the same as a handshake, and it happened 35 kilometers below the surface. This tiny cause producing such a massive effect underlines the fundamental nonlinearity, the fact that tiny changes make big differences mean that
So it's almost like
prediction is
sort of
really
breaking a
not
matchstick and causing a building to fall over. Something called slow earthquakes. Now, if I've read it correctly, this is round about the San Andreas off California. This was sort of tiny, tiny little movements that everybody thought might ease some of the pressure. I'm reading now that there are scientists who believe actually it is accelerating the potential for bigger earthquakes. Right or wrong?
Well, slow earthquakes happen deep beneath subduction zones. So where an oceanic plate is being forced under a continental plate, for example, on the west coast of North America or in Sumatra, Japan, it so happens that at depth beneath the main seismically active areas, you do get slow slip on the interface between the 2 plates.
Yeah, and
Now,
Chris,
these do not release stress.
this is what I was going to say, is according to my notes here, it says this discovery overturned the long-standing belief that the fault was slowly and safely releasing energy, which reduced the chances of a big earthquake. I'll come to you two in the studio in just a moment, I do promise.
No,
But
yeah,
Chris, your point on that,
processes
your response to that.
Yes, well, the only point I was going to add was that there has been a lot of very interesting research on that recently, and some very groundbreaking drilling activity, so scientific drilling through the trenches in Japan to study those slow slip effects and to see what effect that has on earthquake, and as you say, whether the strain is being dissipated slowly or being stored. So I think we're going to learn a lot more about that in the years to come.
Okay, back with you two in Australia and in Edinburgh in just a moment. Let's bring it back into the studio. And Andreas, let me ask you, you're a buildings expert, a civil engineer. How much better prepared are large urban centres now than they were perhaps 35 years ago?
Well, they're certainly better prepared in the sense that the building stock is not the same as it was 2 or 3 decades ago. The problem is the following, that the new buildings, they are built according to seismic codes which are definitely better than the previous ones. But the real problem, in my opinion, is what happens with the existing buildings. Okay? The ones that were built in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, or even before that, of course, the historic structures. What do you do with them? Because some of them were not built according to any seismic code at all. And some of them in the 70s, for example, they were built according to rudimentary codes, codes that do not really satisfy the performance requirements that we have nowadays. So this is my suggestion as to what the focus should be. The focus should go to the really vulnerable structures, and these are mainly the older buildings.
But you know, there's going to be somebody somewhere always wanting to cut costs, and therefore the shoddy structures are inevitable, aren't they, unless you have a universal code and universal means of inspecting?
Well, these are interrelated, but these are 2 separate issues in a sense, because having a good code and enforcing the use of the code, they are not exactly the same thing. But I take your point that there are countries where the level of supervision of construction work is really poor. And there is always the danger that they do not really comply with what is written on the design study of the building. But again, the real problem is the large building stock that existed before the introduction of the modern
And you can't do much about that other than knock it down?
Oh no, you certainly can, but you cannot do it for all of them. Okay, so
you could modify?
Oh yeah, you can certainly. I mean, there have been actually several precedents, some more impressive than others, that in some countries they have strengthened, okay, specific classes of buildings, primarily the ones that are associated with the highest rates. For example, in Cyprus, I know that they have basically strengthened all old existing school buildings for obvious reasons.
Cyprus.
Because okay, so yeah, in Cyprus,
Yeah.
I mean, they have spent a lot of money not building new schools, but rather strengthening the existing ones. And also there have been several strengthening programs in California, more limited strengthening programs in Italy and other parts of the world.
Robin, I'm going to ask the other gentleman in Australia and Edinburgh in just a moment to comment on predictions rather than preventions, because we're talking about the prevention of damage here.
Yeah.
In one of my notes, you told my producer that you believe artificial intelligence will have a role to play, but it hasn't come far enough yet. In what sense will it work?
So this is very preliminary at the moment, but there are a few studies that use AI to try and predict where aftershocks will occur. And there have been some pretty good results coming out. There's one study in particular, I think this one's actually partly sponsored by Google actually, that used real-world data and then worked out where the aftershocks would be, and it was really accurate. But the problem is it's early days, so these programs take a long time to process, so you couldn't use them in the real world now. It's just suggesting that maybe for aftershocks from after a main earthquake, it might help people get away from sort of particularly dangerous zones. But again, that's just a very small part of the future process.
Because although an aftershock is probably smaller than the original earthquake, they can be more devastating because of the way the structures have been damaged.
They can. I mean, it depends on
So
where
you need to know what about aftershock, quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helps. Aftershocks can certainly be dangerous. A lot of it depends on, again, where they take place, what kind of buildings they're taking on, how far away they are from human populations, what the infrastructure is like, what people's awareness of, procedures of shielding themselves are like. So it's just one facet of a really complicated thing, but it might help. It's certainly an up-and-coming thing.
And towards the end of the program, I want to talk about the kind of advice that people should be given if they are in an earthquake. What about satellite imagery? If we haven't got there with AI at the moment, what about satellite imagery, looking at Earth's patterns?
I wouldn't say there's much about prediction and things like that. That's certainly the holy grail of seismology and stuff. But what you can see recently during the Indonesian events is that satellite imagery, which is increasingly being shared freely online by academics, which is great, by the way, shows where landslides have occurred, where liquefaction where the ground turns kind of fluid occurs, sort of thing. And actually, they're really useful after any natural disaster, actually, to show where most of the damage was, and to show where there might be structural weaknesses for the future, to perhaps show where people could be stranded, they haven't been rescued yet. So they're certainly very good for the post-event thing, kind of assessment as well. But satellite imagery has a role to play in any part of the cycle.
But not in prediction, if I may say.
Not in prediction, no.
In managing the post-disaster period, in this respect, I would agree very much.
John McCloskey, is it a failure that we cannot predict?
No, it's just a physical reality. The processes are too nonlinear. In other words, very small causes can have very large effects. It's, the analogy of a sand pile is a very good one, that if you put a grain of sand on top of a sand pile, it can have no effect at all. The grain can just sit on top, or it can produce an avalanche which flattens half the pile. This is a really good analogy to the problem. It's impossible to understand the state of stress and the state of strength on the Earth's crust 30 kilometers below the surface on an area the size of a 50-pence piece. That's the nature of the prediction problem. I would like to come back on the particular issue of aftershocks, because it's something that we work on quite a bit in the geophysics group in Edinburgh. Aftershocks, while it's interesting to hear that there are advances being made in AI to tackle this particular problem, aftershocks are almost a separate population, even though they are made up of normal earthquakes. It is possible now, in real time, to calculate the distribution in magnitude and in number per unit time. And look at the spatial distribution of aftershocks. So we're able to make real-time forecasts of the spatial distribution of events of different sizes during an aftershock sequence. And during the Nepal earthquake, we were able to use this to help humanitarian response during that earthquake. This is something which is already happening. It's something that, for example, my group are working with the Turkish government to try and to enact this science to make it work in practice. So the main problems in terms of aftershocks, for example, are not the science. We've got that pretty much sorted out. That we can do a really good job probabilistically of saying where and what size the aftershocks will be. The problem is the next stage is the training, the political will to implement these actions during aftershock sequences.
Chris,
aftershocks are
sorry, John, I'm going to just bring Chris in at this point. I know you're a geologist, but how can we, given everything that we've discussed so far, how can we make people less vulnerable?
Well, I think we can be aware of what the risk is. That's really the most important thing, I suppose. As John's just explained, it's really difficult to predict when an earthquake will occur and what magnitude it'll be, but we can identify areas where the risk is higher. We can identify areas where the impact might be greater, for instance, areas that are more prone to the sort of liquefaction that we saw following the earthquake in Palu, and we can plan accordingly. It's quite something people don't often realize, but where I live in Australia is quite an earthquake-prone zone, and the work that's done here is to look at the different types of bedrock that are present, look at the frequency of small-scale events to identify where larger events may occur, how often they might repeat, and then how the seismic waves would be transmitted through those different rock types to assess the risk and the likely impacts in different places.
Is there any way that if there's an earthquake in Palu, that you can sort of warn people off the west coast of California, or let's say in southern India around Sri Lanka, you can warn them quickly enough for them to be able to do anything about it?
Well, in terms of tsunami threat, you can, yes, because and that's really the point of the tsunami warning systems, is to first of all identify the wave, the size of the wave, and then to predict how long it's going to take and what magnitude it might have when it reaches places that are more remote from where the earthquake has taken place. So there are some very sophisticated models, for instance.
And very sophisticated, you say. Do you think they work?
Well, I say very sophisticated models of the way at which waves will travel across the ocean. For instance, around the Pacific Ocean, if there's a very big earthquake in California, how that would then impact other places around the Pacific Ocean. So yes, I think they work. Obviously, unfortunately, the only test is going to be when something like that actually happens.
Yeah. So Robin, in terms of the tsunami warning and other warning systems there are.
Yeah.
2004. Very few people who were around at the time will forget what happened in the Indian Ocean. Such a big loss of life. Do you think with what we have now, if the same thing happened, there would be fewer casualties?
It's really hard to say because a lot of it doesn't just depend on an early warning system. Although a major one was set up after that event. You know, the recent example in Indonesia, they have an early warning system too, but it's mainly for like long-range tsunamis, and this tsunami was quite a local one. So even though their system is outdated still, it wouldn't have really picked up on the tsunami in the same way that most people would have expected. But again, the thing with early warning system is a lot of stress is put on that, but actually that way people react when there is an earthquake or signs that a tsunami may be coming is so vital. And I'm sure you saw footage of the tsunami coming in when it hit Palu and things like that, but people shouldn't. There would have been long shaking. They should, even without a warning, they shouldn't have stayed filming this event. You see it with everything, actually, volcanic eruptions. People have this urge to just stay and film things.
But the fact is, you don't know where to go.
Well, I mean, when it's well, that's the thing. Like when it's something like a tsunami or an earthquake, actually, the public awareness of what you should do isn't actually that great generally. Which
is where we come to the civil engineering expert, the person who can tell us whether, if it happens, should I stay where I am inside a building, hoping that it's relatively safe? Should I get out in the streets where there's less above me at that particular time? What should I do?
Well, if you allow me, just a short comment on the previous point, early warning systems and risk reduction and so on. I think people tend to overemphasize the issue of early warning and forget how exactly we reduce risk. Because risk is three things. It's hazard, which is the probability of having a specific, let's say, magnitude or intensity of earthquake. It is vulnerability, how vulnerable your structures are, and it is exposure, how many structures are exposed to the earthquake. So you cannot control the hazard. The hazard is there. It's a natural phenomenon. You cannot really control exposure. I mean, the big cities will keep expanding and expanding, and nobody can really stop them. So the only thing that you can really control is vulnerability. So in my opinion, what we should focus on should be, as I said previously, strengthen as much as feasible the existing structure.
Okay, so you can't really say whether you should run or stay put. I mean, it is as simple as that, isn't it?
Well,
St. John wants to jump in. I've got a question for you in just a minute, but please say what you're going to say.
Yeah, I think what Andreas is saying and what Robin's saying there, I think both of these things are really important. First of all, early warning. Okay, early warning is important for tsunamis at long range. In other words, an earthquake in Japan, an early warning in California can definitely save lives. In Palu, however, the reliance on the possibility of an early warning system helping actually detracted from the clear warning that came from the extensive and elongated shaking that would have been felt in the town. So once you feel that shaking in an area like Palu, you don't wait for a warning. The correct behaviour is to evacuate.
Okay, I've got to go to Australia. Quick question, are we ever going to be able to not just predict earthquakes, but prevent them?
No, I think is a very quick answer to that. The forces at work and the way in which they interact with the different rocks that are present is no, there's nothing we can do to stop them.
So Bruce Willis, meteorites, nuclear bombs, none of this is going to help?
Unfortunately not.
We just have to...
But urbanization is happening now. The world cities are expanding rapidly. So Andreas mentioned the fact that we can reduce the vulnerability. 60% of the world's urban area that will exist in 2030 hasn't been built yet. This is the one-off, time-limited opportunity to make a massive difference, and we need to act now.
Okay, listen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, all of you, in Perth, Western Australia, in Edinburgh, to my guests here in the studio. So many ideas. No, we will never be able to prevent them, as Chris was saying, but perhaps because there is no scientific approach, one should follow the advice of the sanandreasfault.org, who say the best way to prepare for the big one is to go camping for 2 weeks. There you go. Advice and information here on Roundtable from me, David Foster, from my guests. Thank you very much for watching. Roundtable at YouTube is where you can catch up on all of the shows, not just this one, but past ones too. And we look forward to your company next time. Goodbye for now.